The snow had buried the cabin door under 6 feet of white silence, and outside George Ainsworth was shouting for help that would never come in time. Inside his tunnel, 30 feet below the surface, Silas Drummond moved through warm lamplight toward his food stores, untouched by the storm that was killing his neighbor. Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival and impossible ingenuity move you. Hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story might be the most unbelievable one yet. The first snow came to the Judith River Basin on October 23, 1886, 3 weeks earlier than any trapper in the region could remember. Silas Drummond stood outside the cabin he shared with William Fletcher and watched the flakes fall thick and heavy through air that felt wrong. The cold had teeth to it. Not the clean, sharp cold of normal Montana autumns, but something deeper. Something that seemed to reach through his wool coat and fur vest and settle into his bones with a promise of worse to come. Silas was 38 years old that fall. He had spent 9 winters in Montana Territory, trapping beaver and marten along the tributaries that fed into the Missouri River system. He was not the most successful trapper in the region, but he was among the most reliable. Other men took risks, pushed into dangerous country, occasionally made fortunes, or just as often disappeared. Silas trapped methodically. He checked his lines on schedule. He processed his furs with care. He survived. William Fletcher was different. 10 years younger, optimistic in the way men who have not yet lost anything tend to be, William approached trapping as an adventure that happened to pay. He had arrived in Montana 3 years earlier from Ohio, carrying enthusiasm and decent carpentry skills, but limited wilderness experience. Silas had partnered with him in the spring of 1885. The arrangement worked. William's energy balanced Silas's caution. They had completed 2 seasons together and built a serviceable camp 4 miles from the nearest neighbor. Their cabin was typical of the region. Logs cut from lodgepole pine, notched at the corners, chinked with mud and moss. A single room 16 feet square with a dirt floor and a simple stone fireplace. William had built using creek rock and clay mortar. The door was thick planks hung on iron hinges Silas had packed in from Fort Benton. 1 window covered with oiled rawhide let in gray light. The roof was pole rafters covered with bark and sod. It kept out rain and wind. By the standards of Montana trappers in 1886, it was adequate shelter. But standing in that October snow, watching the flakes accumulate faster than seemed natural, Silas felt the first whisper of unease. He had seen hard winters. He knew cold. But something about this early snow, the weight of it, the persistence, made him think of previous years, when late storms had buried trap lines and forced trappers to wait days before they could move. He imagined that scenario extended. A week, 2 weeks, a month, trapped inside while snow piled higher. William came out of the cabin carrying an armload of firewood. He dumped it beside the door and grinned at Silas through the falling snow. "Winter's here early, means we'll have plenty of time to play cards." Silas nodded but did not smile. He was counting how many cords of wood they had stacked, calculating how many days it would last if they could not get outside. William noticed the silence, and his grin faded slightly. "You worried about something?" Silas shook his head. "Just paying attention." William shrugged and went back inside. The snow fell for 3 days. November arrived with temperatures that made October seem mild. The thermometer Silas kept nailed to the cabin wall dropped to 40 degrees below zero and stayed there for 6 consecutive days. The cold was absolute. It turned breath to ice crystals before it left your mouth. It made metal tools painful to touch even through gloves. It created a silence in the forest that felt like the world had stopped breathing. On November 14th, William Fletcher decided to check their northern trap line. The line ran 2 miles up a creek drainage where they had set 20 traps in September. They had not checked it in 10 days because of the cold and snow. Furs left too long in traps could be damaged by scavengers or weather. William wanted to salvage what they could before the pelts were ruined. Silas argued against it. The sky had that flat gray quality that meant more snow was coming. The wind was picking up. But William was restless from days inside the cabin. He needed to move, to do something productive. He promised to be back before dark. He took his rifle, his pack, and a length of rope for hauling any pelts he recovered. Silas watched him disappear into the trees heading north. The snow started 2 hours later. Not heavy at first, just steady flakes through still air. By midday, it was falling harder. By mid-afternoon, the wind arrived and turned the snowfall into a whiteout. Silas kept the fire high and periodically went to the door to look north. He saw nothing but white chaos. He told himself William would find shelter. There were overhangs along the creek, places to wait out the worst of it. Darkness came early. William did not return. Silas stayed awake through the night, feeding the fire, listening for sounds that never came. The wind howled. Snow hissed against the cabin walls. When dawn finally broke gray and cold, the storm had passed, but the damage was done. Snow lay waist-deep in the clearing around the cabin. Drifts reached the roof line on the north side. Silas put on every piece of warm clothing he owned. He took rope, his rifle, and a shovel. He followed the direction William had gone, but the new snow had erased all tracks. He moved slowly through the drifts, calling William's name into the silence. The creek drainage was a maze of white. Everything looked different under the new snow. Familiar landmarks were buried or transformed. He found William a half-mile from the cabin. His partner was sitting against a tree, covered in snow, frozen solid. His rifle lay beside him. His pack was still on his back. There were tracks in the snow around the tree, circular, wandering. William had been walking in circles. Mild hypothermia caused confusion. He had probably thought he was heading toward the cabin. Instead, he had walked away from it until exhaustion and cold stopped him permanently. Silas stood looking at his partner's body for a long time before he started the work of bringing him back. Burying William Fletcher in frozen ground took Silas 2 full days. He selected a spot on a rise above the cabin where spring runoff would not disturb the grave. The ground was iron hard. He built fires to thaw the earth a few inches at a time, then dug with pick and shovel until he hit frozen soil again. More fire, more digging. The process was brutally slow. By the time he lowered William's body into the shallow grave and covered it with stones to keep scavengers away, his hands were raw and his back felt broken. He spent that night sitting by the fire, unable to sleep, replaying William's death in his mind. His partner had not died from a bear attack or a fall through ice or any of the dramatic dangers that killed trappers in stories. He had died from disorientation, from not being able to find his way back to shelter that was less than a mile away. The snow and whiteout had turned familiar country into a featureless maze. William had simply gotten lost and walked until the cold stopped him. The simplicity of it terrified Silas more than violence would have. You could prepare for bears. You could avoid thin ice. But snow that deep, wind that blinding, could turn your own camp into a place you could not reach even when it was close enough to see, on a clear day. And once the snow buried structures, once drifts piled 6 or 8 feet high, you became a prisoner. The cabin door opened outward. A heavy drift against it would seal the door as effectively as nailing it shut. The window was covered with rawhide that could be torn away in an emergency, but if snow pressed against the walls to the roof line, even the window became useless. Silas began cataloging vulnerabilities. If a major storm buried the cabin for an extended period, he would be trapped inside with whatever supplies happened to be in the structure at that moment. His main food cache was in a separate root cellar 40 feet from the cabin, built into a hillside with a low door. In deep snow, that door would be completely inaccessible, his woodshed equally buried. The spring where he got water was 50 yards away through trees. In waist-deep snow with high winds, that 50-yard walk could become as deadly as the 2-mile journey that killed William. December passed in a blur of trap-checking and obsessive thinking. Silas could not stop analyzing the problem. Other trappers accepted the risk. George Ainsworth, whose cabin was 8 miles southeast, told him as much when Silas visited in late December to trade coffee for tobacco. George was 52, a veteran of 18 Montana winters. You just keep extra supplies inside and wait out the bad storms. Been doing it for years. But William Fletcher was dead. and Silas knew that acceptance was not the same as solution. Somewhere between Christmas and New Year, the obsession crystallized into decision. He would build a way to access his supplies that did not depend on surface travel. He would dig tunnels. January 1887 brought a brief warming period. Temperatures climbed to 20 degrees above zero, almost balmy compared to the previous month. Snow settled and compacted. Silas used the reprieve to finalize his plan. He would dig an underground tunnel system connecting his cabin to the three structures that held his survival supplies. Cabin to root cellar to woodshed, a branch to the spring for water access. If deep snow made surface travel impossible, he would move underground. He sketched rough diagrams on the back of an old newspaper, calculating distances and angles. The root cellar was 40 feet from the cabin, the woodshed another 30 feet beyond that. The spring was off to the side, perhaps 50 feet from the root cellar if he angled the tunnel correctly. Total excavation distance would be over 100 feet through frozen ground. The tunnel would need to be tall enough to move through without crawling. 4 feet high minimum, 3 feet wide. That meant moving tons of earth and rock with a shovel and pick. More critically, the tunnel would need reinforcement or it would collapse. Silas had seen mine tunnels during a supply trip to Fort Benton 2 years earlier. They used timber shoring or stone archways to support the ceiling. Timber would rot eventually. Stone would last. He decided on stone arches, built in segments every 8 to 10 feet along the tunnel length. It would require hauling hundreds of flat rocks from the creek bed and carefully fitting them together. The work would take months. On January 23rd, Silas walked to George Ainsworth's cabin to trade furs and mentioned his plan. George was cleaning his rifle by the fire when Silas explained the tunnel system. George stopped mid-stroke and stared at him. "You planning to dig tunnels? Underground tunnels? Through frozen ground?" Silas nodded. George set down his rifle and laughed. "That's the craziest damn thing I've heard all winter. You know how hard that ground is? You'll break your back and your tools before you get 10 feet. Silas explained his reasoning. Deep snow. Inaccessible supplies. William's death. George listened but remained unconvinced. Even if you dig it, and that's a big if, the whole thing will collapse first time we get heavy snow. Weight will cave in your dirt tunnels like they were never there. You'll waste 3 months digging yourself a grave." Silas asked how George knew it would collapse. George gestured broadly. "Because that's what dirt does. It falls. You need proper engineering, timber supports, maybe even iron rails like a real mine. You got any of that? You got engineering training?" Silas admitted he did not. George nodded, as if that settled the matter. "Then you're wasting your time. Better to stock more supplies inside your cabin and wait out storms like the rest of us." It's worked for 18 years. Silas thanked him for the advice and headed home. 2 other trappers George mentioned the plan to over the next week had similar reactions. Drummond's lost his mind. Digging tunnels like a damn badger. He'll kill himself for nothing. Silas started digging on January 28th. Silas began excavation inside the cabin, marking a section of dirt floor near the back wall. He built a fire directly on the ground and let it burn for 3 hours, feeding it constantly until the earth beneath glowed with heat. When he cleared the ashes, the top 6 inches of soil were soft enough to dig. Beneath that, frozen hardpan that resisted his shovel like concrete. He built another fire, waited, dug again. The process was maddeningly slow. A full day of work yielded a hole 3 feet deep and 4 feet across. He angled the tunnel downward at a gentle slope, heading toward where he knew the root cellar sat. The excavated dirt he hauled outside in a bucket and scattered away from the cabin. As the tunnel extended, he had to crawl deeper inside to reach the working face. He built small fires at the tunnel end to thaw the ground ahead, working in cramped darkness broken only by candlelight. His shoulders scraped the tunnel walls. His back screamed from the awkward position. After 5 days, he had advanced 8 feet. The first stone arch took a week to construct. Silas had studied the creek bed during the January thaw, selecting flat limestone rocks that would stack cleanly. He hauled them back to camp on a makeshift sled, sometimes bringing only 3 or 4 stones per trip because of their weight. The arch required a temporary wooden frame to hold the stones in position while he fitted them together. He cut saplings and bent them into a curved support structure, then carefully placed each stone, using creek clay mixed with gravel as mortar between them. The keystone, the final wedge-shaped rock at the arch's peak, took him an entire afternoon to shape and fit correctly. When he tapped it into place and removed the wooden supports, the arch held. The weight from above compressed the stones together, making the structure stronger rather than weaker. He tested it by piling rocks on top. The arch distributed the load outward into the tunnel walls. It was solid. February and March passed in exhausting routine. Wake before dawn, eat cold jerky and hardtack, descend into the tunnel. Build fire to thaw ground. Dig, haul dirt. Build fire again. Dig more. Every 8 feet, construct another stone arch. His hands developed permanent calluses. His fingernails cracked and bled. He lost weight despite eating every scrap of food available. The physical toll was immense, but the tunnel advanced steadily. 3 feet per week, sometimes 4 if the ground cooperated. By late March, he broke through into the root cellar. The moment his shovel punched into open air and he felt the temperature change, he nearly wept with relief. He widened the opening and crawled through into the familiar space where potatoes and carrots and smoked meat hung from ceiling hooks. 40 feet of tunnel, 5 stone arches. It had taken 2 months of brutal labor. He lit a candle in the root cellar and looked back at the tunnel entrance. Air moved through it. The ventilation worked. The stone arches were not arbitrary decoration. They were the reason the tunnel system would survive. Silas understood. This instinctively, even without formal engineering training. An arch converted downward weight into outward pressure. The stones pressed against each other and against the tunnel walls, creating a structure that became stronger under load rather than weaker. A flat ceiling would collapse under the weight of earth and snow. An arched ceiling distributed that weight and held. Each arch required approximately 30 flat stones. Silas selected them carefully from the creek bed, looking for pieces that were roughly rectangular with at least one flat face. Irregular stones went into the fill between arches. The face stones, the ones that formed the visible curve of the arch, had to fit together with minimal gaps. He shaped them when necessary, using a hand chisel and hammer, chipping away protrusions until the stones seated cleanly against their neighbors. The temporary wooden frame was critical. He bent green willow saplings into a curved form and braced them with cross pieces. This frame supported the arch stones during construction. He started each arch at the base on both sides, working upward symmetrically. The stones tilted slightly inward, leaning against the wooden frame. The final keystone locked everything together. When he drove it into place and removed the frame, the arch stood independently. Between the stones he packed a mixture of creek, clay, and fine gravel. The clay sealed gaps and prevented dirt from filtering through. The gravel gave it body and prevented excessive cracking as it dried. This mortar was not structural. The stones themselves carried the load. But the mortar kept everything aligned and prevented shifting. The tunnel walls were equally important. Silas didn't leave them as raw dirt. He lined the lower 3 feet with flat stones stacked without mortar, creating a retaining wall that prevented the earth from gradually slumping inward. Above the stone lining, the dirt walls were packed hard and smooth. Every few days, he inspected the entire tunnel length, looking for cracks or settling. He found none. The arch design worked. The entrance required special attention. This was where the tunnel met the cabin floor and where the greatest stress would concentrate. Silas built a double arch here, 2 stone arches spaced 3 feet apart with solid stone fill between them. He constructed a wooden frame around the entrance using squared timber for the horizontal lintel and round logs for the vertical posts. The squared beam distributed weight evenly across the top. The round posts resisted compression without any need for processing beyond cutting to length. From the root cellar, Silas began the second tunnel segment toward the woodshed. Another 30 feet. 4 more stone arches. The work was fractionally easier now because he had refined his technique, but the physical demands remained punishing. By mid-April, the tunnel reached the woodshed. He could now move from cabin to food to fuel entirely underground. He started the branch tunnel toward the spring. The system was taking shape exactly as he had envisioned. Spring turned to summer, and Silas continued digging. The branch tunnel to the spring required careful engineering because water was involved. He angled the tunnel to emerge above the spring source, then built a stone-lined access chamber where he could dip buckets without entering the water directly. The chamber included drainage channels that carried overflow back into the creek system. By early June, the water access was complete and functional. With the primary tunnels finished, Silas turned his attention to refinements. He widened sections that were too narrow. He reinforced arches that showed minor settling. He built a proper entrance structure at the main tunnel mouth, the one that opened to the surface near the cabin. This entrance needed to remain accessible even under heavy snow, so he designed it with ventilation in mind. The entrance framework used his hybrid timber approach. A squared horizontal beam spanned the top, providing a flat surface for the stone arch above it. 2 round vertical posts supported the beam, driven deep into the ground for stability. The squared beam took him 3 days to hew from a straight-grained pine log using a broadaxe. The round posts required only cutting to length and setting. Above the timber frame, he built his most elaborate stone arch, using his largest and flattest rocks to create an entrance that would not collapse under any conceivable snow load. George Ainsworth visited in late June, ostensibly to trade ammunition, but really to see what Silas had accomplished. He stood looking at the tunnel entrance for a long time without speaking. Finally, he walked around it, examining the stonework and timber frame. That's a hell of a lot of work for a hole in the ground. Silas showed him the interior, lighting a lamp and leading him through the tunnel to the root cellar, then to the woodshed, then to the spring access. George followed silently, ducking under the stone arches, running his hand along the lined walls. When they emerged back at the cabin, George shook his head. "I'll grant you built it solid. But come winter, when snow piles up, all that weight is going to crush those arches flat. Stone or no stone, dirt can only hold so much." Silas asked what George thought would fail first. George pointed at the entrance. "That arch right there. Snow will pile 10 feet deep and push straight down. Your stones will crack and the whole thing will fold inward like a sinkhole." Word spread through the scattered trapping community. Drummond spent the whole spring digging tunnels under his cabin. Other trappers and a few early homesteaders stopped by to see the curiosity. Most were skeptical. A few were openly mocking. One trapper named Martin Caldwell stood at the entrance and laughed. "Man digs like a prairie dog and thinks he's invented something. Wait till winter proves him wrong." Silas said nothing. He had no interest in arguing. The tunnels would work or they would not. Winter would provide the answer. He spent July and August stockpiling supplies, checking his trap lines, and preparing for whatever the next cold season would bring. The winter of 1887 to 1888 announced itself early and with violence. The first major storm hit on November 6th, 3 days after the first serious cold snap. Silas woke to wind that sounded like a living thing trying to tear the cabin apart. Snow fell so thick he could not see the woodshed 30 feet away. The temperature dropped to 50 degrees below zero and stayed there. The storm lasted 11 days without pause. Snow accumulated steadily, relentlessly. By day 3, the cabin door was blocked. Silas did not bother trying to dig it out. He descended into his tunnel instead, lighting his lamp and moving through the stone-arched passages to the root cellar. He selected potatoes, carrots, and smoked venison for the day's meals. He continued through the connecting tunnel to the woodshed and loaded his arms with split firewood. He returned to the cabin, stoked the fire, and prepared food. The tunnel system worked exactly as designed. By day 6, the snow had buried the cabin completely. Silas could hear it accumulating on the roof, a steady weight pressing down. He climbed into his tunnel and walked to the entrance structure. The entrance remained accessible because of how he had designed the ventilation. Cold air sank through the tunnel, while warm air from his cabin fire rose and escaped through small vents he had built into the entrance arch. This circulation prevented snow from sealing the system completely. He lit his lamp and sat in the tunnel, surrounded by warm golden light reflecting off stone walls. Above him, 6 feet of snow and howling wind. Around him, solid stone arches distributing thousands of pounds of weight safely into the earth. He was comfortable, secure. He had food, fuel, and water, accessible without ever stepping into the storm. The tunnels had transformed a potentially deadly situation into a mere inconvenience. George Ainsworth was not so fortunate. 8 miles away, George sat in his cabin watching his firewood supply dwindle. He had stocked what he thought was adequate fuel inside the structure, but 11 days of constant fire to fight 50 below temperatures consumed wood faster than he had calculated. His main woodpile was outside, buried under snow he could not reach. On day 5, he tried to dig out his door. The snow was compacted by wind into something approaching ice. He managed to create a small depression before exhaustion forced him back inside. By day 9, George was burning furniture. He broke apart his spare chair and fed it to the fire piece by piece. His food situation was better. He had kept beans and salted pork inside. But without fuel, food did not matter. On day 10, he began burning the wooden bed frame. He wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and huddled near the diminishing fire, understanding with growing clarity that he might not survive. The storm howled, the cold pressed against the cabin walls, and George Ainsworth, 52 years old and veteran of 18 Montana winters, began to accept that this might be how he died. The storm broke on the morning of November 17th. Silas emerged from his tunnel entrance into a world transformed. Snow lay 6 feet deep across the clearing. Drifts against the north side of his cabin reached the roof line. The landscape was unrecognizable. Trees were buried to their lower branches. The creek was invisible under white. The sky was clear and painfully blue, and the temperature had dropped even further with the passing of the storm, 60 below zero. Air so cold it hurt to breathe. Silas strapped on the snowshoes he had made the previous winter and began the trek to George Ainsworth's cabin. The journey that normally took 2 hours required 5. He broke a trail through snow that would have been impassable without snowshoes. When he finally reached George's homestead, he found a cabin almost completely buried. Only the peak of the roof and the top of the chimney were visible above the snow. He called George's name. No response. He began digging at what he calculated was the door's location, using a shovel he had carried strapped to his back. The snow was dense and heavy. After an hour, he had excavated down to the door and pounded on it. "George, it's Silas Drummond. Can you hear me?" A long silence, then a weak voice from inside. "Can't open the door. No strength." Silas dug more frantically, clearing snow away until he could pull the door open against its frozen hinges. George Ainsworth sat on the floor near a dead fire, wrapped in blankets, shaking uncontrollably. The interior of the cabin was barely above freezing. Broken furniture lay scattered around the room. The bed frame was gone, fed to the fire days ago. George looked up at Silas, with eyes that had seen the edge of death. "Ran out of wood on day 9. Been burning everything I could. Thought I was finished." Silas rebuilt the fire using wood from George's buried woodpile, which he dug out over the next 2 hours. He melted snow for water. He prepared hot food from supplies he had brought. George thawed slowly, the shaking gradually subsiding as warmth returned to the cabin. When he could finally speak clearly, he looked at Silas for a long moment. "Your tunnel system. You were inside during all that?" Silas nodded. George closed his eyes. "I mocked you. Called it foolish. Said it would collapse." Silas said nothing. George opened his eyes again. "It didn't collapse, did it?" Silas confirmed it had not. George was quiet for several minutes, staring at the fire. "How many others you think made it through?" Silas did not know. Over the next 3 days, as trails became passable, they would learn the answer. Martin Caldwell, the trapper who had laughed at the tunnels, had frozen to death on day 10 when his cabin's chimney became blocked with ice and smoke drove him outside into lethal cold. Another homesteader 7 miles south had survived but lost 3 fingers to frostbite after his fuel ran out. The winter of 1886 to 1887 entered history as the Great Die-Up. Across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota territories, an estimated 60 to 90% of open-range cattle died. Ranchers who had run thousands of head found dozens alive when spring finally came. The winter killed the open-range cattle industry and changed the economics of the western frontier permanently. But cattle were not the only casualties. Isolated trappers, homesteaders, and settlers died by the dozens. Exact numbers were never recorded because many lived alone and their deaths were not discovered until months or years later. In the spring of 1888, George Ainsworth asked Silas to help him design a tunnel system. They spent 3 weeks that April laying out the plan and beginning excavation. George's system was simpler than Silas's, connecting only his cabin to his root cellar, but it used the same stone arch construction and the same entrance framework design. By fall, it was complete. Word continued to spread. Over the next 3 years, 7 other homesteaders within a 20-mile radius built underground tunnel systems. Not all were as elaborate as Silas's original. Some used timber shoring instead of stone arches. Some connected only to food storage rather than multiple structures. But the core principle was identical. When deep snow made surface movement impossible, go underground. The winter of 1889 to 1890 brought another severe storm, though not as catastrophic as the Great Die-Up. Every homesteader with a tunnel system survived without crisis. Those without tunnels faced the same desperate situations as before, burning furniture and rationing supplies. The difference in survival rates was stark enough that tunnel construction became accepted practice rather than eccentric experiment. Silas Drummond continued trapping and living in his Montana cabin through the early 1890s. In 1895, he sold his claim to a homesteading family and moved to Missoula. He was 47 years old, tired of isolation, ready for a different life. He found work as a stonemason, his tunnel-building skills translating directly to construction of foundations and walls. He married in 1897 a widow named Catherine who ran a boarding house. They had no children but lived quietly and comfortably. Silas died in 1911 at age 63 from pneumonia. His obituary in the Missoula newspaper made no mention of tunnels or survival innovations. To his neighbors and friends in town, he was simply a stonemason who had once been a trapper. His widow knew some stories, but not all of them. The details of what he had built faded into the category of things that had happened long ago in a different place. But in the Judith River country, his tunnels remained. In 1903, a family homesteading near the abandoned site of his original cabin discovered the entrance, still intact. The stone arches still held. The passages were dry and structurally sound. The system had survived 16 years of snow, rain, freeze, and thaw without significant deterioration. They used it themselves, expanding it slightly, living in the infrastructure one man's obsession had created with nothing but hand tools and relentless determination.